In 1984, a Russian programmer by the name of Alexei Pajitnov created a little puzzle game known as Tetris for the Electronica 60. Then greedy businessmen dubiously sold rights they didn't have to various companies to make various versions of Tetris. And then there were car chases and stuff. Look, they made a whole movie about all this, so there's no real need to rehash any of this crap. Anyway, Tetris, released in 1988 for the Nintendo Family computer courtesy of Bulletproof Software, would be the first of 4 Tetris games to grace the platform, with only 2 of these games eventually seeing international waters. For the longest time, this particular Tetris was only widely available through import or lucking out on one of those 101 multi-card gimmicks in the wild, which is how I'd play this one actually. That would change decades later with the release of AtGame's Legends Flashback plug-and-play console, host to roughly 50-ish arcade and console titles, one of which includes this version of Tetris. How about that? BPS Tetris, that's what I usually call it, to differentiate it from the other Tetris games on the NES, Famicom, whatever, is a game that's been covered previously, but since that was a decade ago, and we're going to dive into the other 2 NES Tetris games, it's only fair that we revisit this one to see where it all began. Anyway, this being the first Tetris on the Famicom, it's a fairly rudimentary and quite frankly archaic iteration of the Soviet mind game. Single player only, but you could choose your starting stage determining the drop speed of your tetrominoes, the height of garbage blocks in the well for you to contend with, and of course your choice of 3 wonderfully composed background tunes to play during the game, 2 of which can be found in a later Tetris game on the NES, but for this video, we'll stick with the one unique track, Tetris, which happens to be the best track of the bunch. Gameplay in BPS Tetris, naturally, is also fairly basic. You can move left or right, you press down to rotate your piece, and you press A to hard drop the piece to the bottom and lock it into place. That's it. There are no ghost pieces, no infinite spins, no combos, not even a soft drop function or second rotate button. Not only that, but the usual control scheme you'd associate with even the later NES versions of Tetris are flipped, so that's a bit of a rude awakening. And without that soft drop feature that lets you speed up a piece's descent, you're left waiting for that piece to fall down if you're unsure about positioning. And let me tell you, those early speed levels are almost begging for you to hard drop the piece into place and be done with it, but if you do, just make sure you're slotting it in the right place or else you'll regret it. And try to press the right button, because even years later, this one little thing messes me up every so often. The version on the Legends Flashback console tried to quote-unquote fix this by remapping the controls so that pressing down on the D-pad would perform the hard drop and rotating pieces can be done with a button. It kinda, sort of works, and I get the idea to try to make it more like a traditional Tetris control setup, except what they really did was remap it down with another A button. So pressing down on the menus accepted command options, which is, I don't think this is the version of Tetris you should be making available to the masses if you have to do this sort of MacGyvering with the controls. On the other hand though, pressing up still rotates the pieces, so you could pretty much play one-handed Tetris if you wanted to, but I don't know. BPS Tetris does not follow the traditional marathon format of Tetris. Your goal is to clear away 25 lines, however you do that is entirely up to you. Once you clear 25 lines, your score is tallied and you move on to the next stage, which increases the speed of the blocks as well as clear away any garbage blocks up to a certain point depending on the round you're playing. And once you clear stage 9, you'll get a little dance number and the game resets back to stage 0, but now you've increased 1 round of garbage blocks. Clearing stage 9 round 5 will doubly reward you with a fireworks display, and you get to redo stage 0 round 5 all over again, and it loops from there. It never goes faster than stage 9 despite what the demo would have you believe, which might annoy some people who like their Tetris really fast. And of course, if you top out, you lose a life. Yes, BPS Tetris has a live system. You have 3 lives, and if you lose all of them, it's game over. Your score is also tallied at the end of every life, and should you get a high enough score, you get to add your initials to the high score table. Really exciting stuff until you turn off the system and your scores are lost to the annals of time. Like I said before, this is Tetris at its most earliest and rudimentary, despite looking somewhat prettier than the computer versions that preceded it, or even the NES versions that would follow. And for anyone who's only familiar with the modern takes or even the later NES versions, there's a bit of an adjustment and a learning curve to be had in learning the controls and rules of this vintage Tetris, not to mention its comparatively slow speed being somewhat of a sloth. But once you get the hang of it, BPS Tetris has its moments and can be a fun time of a different kind. This is more of a curiosity piece though, less than a nostalgia trip and more of a relic of a different time. Not exactly a game I would expect anyone to stick with for very long, but there is a weird attraction to something this vintage that usually compels me to come back to this one every so often. There's not a whole lot to say about the game visually. The main screen is colorful if nothing else, showing some Russian castle in the background, and the blocks are certainly distinct from each other if nothing else. It's pretty much the only screen you'll be looking at naturally, so at the very least it's not visually boring, which makes it the most exciting looking Tetris game of the bunch. I like the little dancing animations whenever you clear the last stage, and that ending intermission sure is a spectacle. And if nothing else, BPS Tetris does have some killer tracks. The one playing throughout the video and the one I often stick with for this game is a track called Tetris, and is probably the game's best track. But there are also 2 other tracks based on Russian folk tunes that would eventually be included in Tension Tetris, although those tracks sound much richer here than in that version. Less impressive are the sound effects, which are killer of a different kind. Overall, BPS Tetris is the oldest of old-school Tetris on Nintendo's 8-bit machine and is a far cry from your modern interpretations or even the later NES releases. It's basically a remade version of the old computer versions with nicer graphics and sound, but there's a weird appeal I can't explain that merits a replay every so often. This being a Japan-only release, your best bet of playing this is either import one of those multi-cart things, or if you could track down one of those at-games Legends flashback systems from a few years back, and honestly, it's worth sampling at least once, just to see where it almost all began.